There is a frequency that shouldn't exist, a signal that hides in the fractures of the spectrum, a ghost that lives between the stations, in the dead air where only the hiss of a dying universe is supposed to reside. It's an ocean of noise, and most people who stumble upon it hear only chaos, a meaningless roar they are quick to escape. They turn the dial, seeking the comfort of a human voice or a familiar song. But Elias was different. He didn't turn the dial. He listened. He leaned in closer. For 6 months a year, Elias was a ghost himself, a fire lookout haunting a steel tower in the vast silent expanse of the North Cascades. His only company was the sighing of the wind through ancient pines and the crackle of a battery-powered shortwave radio. It was his one tether to a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away. He'd spend hours charting weather patterns, noting the barometric pressure, filling his logbook with the mundane poetry of solitude. But lately the entries had become strange. He wrote of winds that seemed to carry whispers, of atmospheric pressure drops that defied all meteorological logic. He was trying to find a rational explanation for the growing unease that had settled over his isolated world. The real explanation, however, began on a Tuesday at exactly 3:33 a.m. The static didn't just hiss, it breathed. A slow, deep, impossibly organic inhalation that seemed to draw all the warmth from the small cabin. At first, it sounded like a mistake, a technical glitch, a rhythmic scratching, faint and distant, like a fingernail dragging across a chalkboard miles and miles away. He noted it in his logbook. Anomalous signal interference, source unknown. But the next night, it returned, louder. The rhythm was no longer random. It began to sync with the frantic beating of his own heart. Thump, 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 thump. A cold dread washed over him. This wasn't interference. This was a response. With a trembling hand, Elias turned the volume up, the knob grinding under his fingers. He had to know. From the deepest, darkest depths of the static, a voice began to coalesce. It didn't use words. It didn't need them. It used the sound of a woman crying. But the sound was played in reverse, a horrifying backward wail that clawed at the edges of his sanity. It was a lamentation that didn't mourn a loss, but promised one. By the second week, the radio didn't need to be turned on. The static had seeped out of the speaker and into the very bones of the cabin. It was a low, granular hum that vibrated in the floorboards and whispered from the frost-caked window panes. Elias found himself sitting in the dark, his hand hovering over the dial, a useless reflex. He hadn't slept in 72 hours. He'd tried to rationalize it in his logbook, his entries growing more frantic. He told himself it was the isolation, the high-altitude psychosis. He recited the symptoms he'd memorized from the manual: auditory hallucinations, paranoia, a distorted sense of time. It was all in his head. It had to be. But the static was changing. The random hiss began to coalesce, forming rhythmic pulses that mimicked a human heartbeat. Then it sharpened, taking on a sibilant, breath-like quality. It was searching for a shape, a form, and then it found one. The radio spoke his name, not in the reverse-crying voice from before, but in his own voice. A perfect, chilling replica, as if he were hearing a recording of himself. Every inflection, every slight imperfection, was there.
Elias! The speaker crackled, the sound both intimately familiar and profoundly alien. Check the perimeter. The door is unlocked.
A cold dread, sharper than the mountain air, pierced through his exhaustion. His eyes darted to the heavy iron bolt on the cabin door. It was slid firmly into place, a dark, solid line against the pale wood. A fortress against the storm. A lie. The voice was lying. But as he watched, transfixed, the bolt began to vibrate. A low hum resonated through the room, a physical presence that made his teeth ache. It wasn't from a hand on the other side, or the wind battering the walls. The sound waves were coming out of the radio. The frequency was so impossibly precise, so perfectly tuned, it was physically manipulating the metal from across the room. It was a key made of sound. The vibration stopped as abruptly as it began. The bolt remained in place, but the message was clear. The lock was irrelevant. The perimeter was already breached. The thing in the radio wasn't just listening anymore, it was learning. It had found his voice. Now it was testing its own. He threw the radio out of the 60-foot tower. With a final, desperate heave, he sent the cursed box tumbling into the void. He watched it smash into 100 pieces on the jagged rocks below, a brief, violent firework of plastic and wire. And then, silence. A profound, beautiful silence he hadn't realized he'd forgotten. The oppressive hum that had burrowed into his skull was finally gone. For 10 minutes, he breathed. Deep, shuddering gulps of cold, clean air. He felt the tension drain from his shoulders, the frantic pulse in his temples begin to slow. It was over. He had won. Then the wind began to change. It wasn't a natural shift. The familiar whistle through the pines was gone, replaced by something else. A low crackle like dust on a vinyl record began to weave through the air. The wind wasn't blowing anymore. The wind was staticking. He moved to the window, peering out into the gloom, trying to understand. Every leaf that rustled, every branch that swayed, didn't sound like a forest. It sounded like a crushed radio signal, a chorus of broken transmissions. The entire forest had become the speaker. He looked out, and he didn't see trees. He saw the world de-resing before his eyes. The familiar greens and browns bled away, replaced by jagged, vertical lines of grey and black, a television screen that had lost its signal. He stumbled back from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. The phenomenon wasn't just outside, it was inside too. The metal of the tower groaned, not from the wind, but with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through the soles of his boots. On his desk, the pages of his logbook began to flutter, the ink of his own entries bleeding and running, reforming into oscillating wave patterns. The numbers he'd obsessively logged, 333, stamped themselves over and over again on the page, a mocking, looping echo. It was then that Elias realized the horrifying truth. He hadn't destroyed the signal, he had released it. The frequency wasn't trying to talk him. It was rewriting everything. It was rewriting. He looked down at his hands. They were blurring at the edges, the lines of his palms and knuckles losing their definition, turning into flickering pixels of white and grey. A strange coldness spread through his fingertips, a numbness that felt like disconnection. He watched, paralyzed by terror, as tiny squares of light began to flake away from his skin, dissolving into the air like digital dust. He tried to clench his fists, to feel the reassuring solidity of his own body, but the sensation was distant, muted. He tried to scream, to let out the terror that was consuming him, but the only sound that came out of his throat was the sound of a dead station. A hollow, rasping hiss of pure, empty static. If you're listening to this late at night, check your speakers. Some sounds don't come from the world you know. They come from the gaps in between. Sleep well, if you can.